Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Biller. I'm the Executive Director of Vantage Ventures at West Virginia University. And I'm flattered to be here tonight with such a distinguished group of panelists on a topic that is so germane to the future of society in many industries. We see the application of artificial intelligence already today in our lives. It's influencing the way, for instance, packages are delivered to us. It influences our financial decisions. It helps better detect fraud. Certainly in today's world where we're largely digital, we see it influencing even how we're acting and with the prompts we get from our computers on how we behave. And I think it's probably important for us to realize that these systems, when powered by intelligent technology, though they make us more capable, they also make us more efficient. And as the world becomes more efficient, we have to think about these applications and the consequence of society. Efficiency generally raises all ships, and we know that to be the case. But I think in this dialogue today, we're going to question if artificial intelligence does that, and does it do it equally? And as we think about its vast potential, we think now is the right time to talk about the importance of ethics in artificial intelligence. We're not only on the cusp of the adoption of emerging technologies that make all of our lives better, but we're also redefining what it means to have the ethical implication of these systems. And I started out and said, I'm so thrilled to be joined by our panelists. Brandon, if you can bring them on the screen with me, I'd love for them to have an opportunity to really introduce themselves, talk about their knowledge and their experience, and then also take us through a series. We're going to spend about 45 minutes in dialogue, and then we're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. And so without further ado, I'm going to call on you because it's like a Brady Bunch on my screen, probably like everybody else's. Dave, may I ask you to go first, introduce yourself and share a little bit about what brought you here tonight?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it. And yeah, so hi, everyone. My name is David Fergale. I am an executive in residence at West Virginia University's Chambers College. I'm a native West Virginian. I've spent the last 20 years or so of my career kind of in major cities around the US, so in DC, and then most recently in Boston for the last 7 years. In addition to being an executive in residence here, I also run my own consulting firm, and I work a lot with early stage ventures and companies, mostly around strategy related issues, all related to emerging tech. And so I've spent the last 6-7 years, I guess, building businesses centered around innovative tech, such as blockchain technology, the Internet of Things, machine learning, and AI. As we all know, it's very combinatorial, in which technologies have really started to conflate and start to merge. And a lot of my most recent work is around really a myriad of various technologies coming together to create new business models. And a lot of that is what I'm doing, in addition to being here in West Virginia. A lot of that work is just global. So that's me, and that's my quick intro, but very happy to be here. Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone.
Thank you. Laura?
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thrilled to be here. And thank you everybody for your time and for joining us today for this important discussion. So I'm Laura Kornhauser. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Stratify. Our technology helps organizations answer questions, we like to say, too important to get wrong and too sensitive not to understand. So we are very committed to provide a differentiated level of transparency in our solutions, and definitely relates to our discussion today because we are in the AI and machine learning space, helping primarily financial institutions make more accurate predictions about the future and decisions around those predictions. Decisions like who to lend to or what to investigate for potential fraud. And this allows them to serve more customers, increase profits, and also ensure regulatory compliance. And what we see is one of the biggest differentiators of our approach versus others in the market is the transparency offered by our approach that enables the ability for humans to input their knowledge, their expertise, their information, in addition to the insights automatically extracted from data. And this transparency also enables us to help both identify and proactively mitigate unconscious bias in both data and models, which is another huge focus of us related to this topic of conversation. And before founding Stratify, I spent over a decade in financial services, primarily at JP Morgan, in a variety of different risk management roles, where I experienced a lot of, I'll say, the challenges of working with or trying to work with, I'll say, newer and newer technologies to help address customer problems in a changing regulatory environment. So very happy to be here for this discussion, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming together today.
Laura, thank you. So nice to have you. Tim, will you introduce yourself?
Sure. And yeah, I'm mountain biking in Vermont this week, and I stupidly forgot to bring anything with me except for mountain biking clothes. So just in case you think you're looking at one of the first members of the Space Force or something like that, I just want to correct that impression. I apologize. So I'll start way back at college, and I love to program. My favorite classes were programming way back. This is decades ago in college. And at the end of college, I really gave it some thought and decided that the programming technology thing was really going nowhere, and went to law school. So, and my decision-making has kind of deteriorated since then. So I spent a few years as a corporate lawyer in corporate finance, and the internet came along to just kind of age myself in the .com era, and I decided that I'd go back and do what I wanted to do. And so I jumped in with both feet and started one of the first internet companies based solely focusing on financial services, which was, believe it or not, quite unique at that point in time, and ended up bounced around a little bit, but we ended up basically building the intranets, the back office intranets for the large Wall Street firms, and did that for a few years and sold that company to Thomson Reuters, and spent a few years moving all of their data and publishing products online. And it was an interesting time because compare then to now, and I think this is important. We could call up just about anybody. I mean, if you knew the difference between a bond and a stock, and you knew HTML, you could get an appointment at Goldman Sachs in the next few days and talk to one of their senior executives. And technology was just viewed then as, one of those back office things that gets done by somebody else, where, and I've witnessed this over the last, 20 years or so, where technology has moved from kind of a also ran operational thing to now at the forefront of every large corporation's strategy and focus on the future. And so the world's changed quite a bit. Skip ahead a few years, I was fortunate enough to be invited to have lunch with Elizabeth Warren back around 2007. And she asked me, as an entrepreneur, would I jump in and help her create the first new consumer agency in about 40 years in the federal government. And there was a team of about, 7 or 8 of us, and it was all of about a law review article back then. And so we went along. I didn't think it would get too far, but fortunately, then President-elect Obama decided he would make it one of the most important key items in his agenda. So I spent a few years working on Dodd-Frank, which incorporated the CFPB. Then I went through to head up the technology at CFPB, and did that through the Obama administration. And then after that, the last few years, I've been working mostly in the nonprofit world, focusing in financial technology, and how can we begin to use tools like AI to benefit people, rather than sell them something. How can we begin to sort of downstream those tools so people who maybe aren't the most desirable in terms of major financial service companies because of profitability, how can we filter down those tools, the benefits of those tools to that population in the US? And I now have my organization is called FinTech Commons. It's a nonprofit up in Boston.
Tim, thank you. We're not going to go here, but I will say, I thought when you showed up in that outfit, you were channeling your inner desire to come to West Virginia and be the first person to ride Virgin Hyperloop's pod. No, no, that's not what you were thinking.
No, I'm ready. That's right.
Okay,
I
awesome.
needed the helmet.
So that's another discussion for another day, but thank you for joining us and bringing that amazing experience and sense of style. You're totally in good company. But, you know, I want to pick up, Tim, you just said something that I think is critically important, and it's been a thread that David brought to us, and Laura, you called it out as well, and that's the personal nature of AI, the influence that it has on our personal life. And I'll go there first, and then I think we ought to lift up and think about the consequences of if we don't consider the ethical dynamics of AI on society, and then we'll come back down to what it means to us as individuals. So let's start with the personal, because Laura, you said it. Tim, you mentioned personal. David, you talked about it in the context of your own broad scope globally. Laura, you said AI is too important to get wrong, but you touched on another note. You said it's too sensitive. Right? And I think that sensitivity and that, what I would use the word subtlety that AI has pervaded our life, right? It is this interplay, this impact. You know, we're sort of thinking about the earliest stages, as I think, but you might tell me I'm wrong, but the earliest stages of how AI is exhibiting its ability to influence us. How do you think AI in what we see today, and we'll get to tomorrow later, but today, it's influencing and changing our behavior and how we interact with even one another or even in our day-to-day? What is it about the personal that makes you think about AI being too sensitive?
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that. You know, I think you're absolutely right, Sarah. I'd say we're still, a lot of progress has been made in the application and use of AI, but I would still say, if we're using a sports analogy, we're in the early innings of all that it can possibly do, and still a heck of a long way away from a lot of what you see in the movies about where it could go, both I'll say in positive and more scary 80s movies versions as well. So I would say we're still in early days. But what we are starting to see is that it's being used to make decisions that have more and more impact on our lives and on the lives of everyday individuals out there. Whether that's to, what job you get or what job you're interviewed for example, to, one of the things we're focused on to what loan you get or what rate you get, to anything from that to other ways that it's been used. And unfortunately, a lot of flaws have come into being used in our judicial system to try to correct human bias, and some of that has not, I'll say, gone the way folks intended it to. So it's being used, and again, AI is a broad church, it means a lot of things, but being used more and more to make decisions that have a greater impact on the lives of people. There's a ton of opportunity that comes with that, but there's a tremendous amount of responsibility that comes with it as well. And that's why I believe very strongly that to live up to that level of responsibility of the technology and all of its great promise, this need for understanding that technology and how exactly it's being built, by whom, with what parameters, how it's designed is so important to make sure that it's doing the things we want it to do and the things that we ideally intend it to. So I'll pause there.
Well, I appreciate it, because I asked you a very convoluted and complex question without setting a framework. So I apologize, a little nervous.
No, it's a good one.
But I think we ought to take a moment. And before you answer that question, Laura, I think I'm just going to ask you for a minute. You did, I think it's right. AI is a broad church. Can you ground us? And I'm going to ask both David and Tim to also ground us. What's your definition of AI? Like, what is it? And then we'll go and unpack the other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So broad church, I think at its broadest, it's used as a term or an umbrella term for the science behind using machines to solve problems, and what types of problems those machines are solving and how exactly they're solving, again, can fall in a wide range of methods, from your what is considered your more rudimentary or robotic tasks up to your approaching your more thoughtful and creative tasks. One definition that I think can be helpful is the separation between what folks call a narrow AI, which is most of what we see in applications today, or most of what we see being used today. And that is, you know, a computer or an intelligent system that has been taught to do something, and taught to do it, if you will, a predefined task. When we get more towards that creative side of that spectrum, what folks, you hear people call AGI, or artificial general intelligence. That's what Westworlds and the other things that primarily are in movies right now, and depending on who you talk to, you know, we're decades away from that, or hundreds of years away from that. I don't know where I fall out of that, but I'll put that as a broad landscape for AI for Tim and Dave to fill in on.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to go ahead, kind of unpack what AI is from that, what Laura just said? What's your definition? And then Tim, I'm going to come to you, and then we're going to pick back up this idea of what it means to us personally. Laura, I'm going to come back to you on something you said too. But David, may I ask you, what do you think of, what is AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I mean, just looking at it from my angle, I would make it, I'm going to try to make it super simple here, but I think it works. You know, humans and, you know, animals, right, have intelligence. They're intelligent beings. They perceive, you know, we perceive information and data. You know, we take that data, we learn, we solve problems, really. Essentially, that's like the core of what we do with intelligence as a human, and same with animals, right? And I think what's interesting about humans in that regard with intelligence is that, you know, our position at the top of the food chain is really dependent upon our intelligence. It's not because we're super strong or we're, you know, the fastest animal. It's because of our intelligence, right? And I think what I would relate that to is like starting with that as our base understanding of intelligence, humans and animals. You know, AI really just, to me, takes computers and or machines, and it allows those machines through software code and algorithms to perform cognitive functions similar to those of humans and animals, right? So I think I take more of like the relational perspective to what is intelligence to me, and that's really, you know, us as humans and in species like animals, and I relate it to that, and I think that is that's sort of where I ground my look into what is, and my definition of what is artificial intelligence. So.
David, thank you. Tim, you want to share your perspective on what AI is?
Sure. You know, I hate to drag this all down to my level. Instead of going from graduate school to junior high here, but I look at it kind of simplistically in that it's just simply we're outsourcing decisions to machines. And, you know, I kind of think about the machines as sort of a big black box. And, you know, I understand it's more complex with algorithms, et cetera. But to me, the issue is really we're outsourcing decisions now in this manner. And what kind of framework? We don't really have a framework for what decisions should be outsourced. I mean, we're deciding who gets credit now. We're deciding who gets insurance. We're deciding what kind of treatment to give different people and medical treatment. We're deciding who goes to jail and who doesn't. You know, and we're outsourcing those decisions to technology today. And you know, the question is, how much thought have we really given to that? And you know, you go back and you think about, well, put the technology aside, what decisions would you outsource in your life? You know, would you outsource your decisions, medical decisions, to someone else? Who would that be? There's all sorts of things, you know, that we kind of develop criteria as people in terms of where we might not outsource a decision to someone else, but we now actually have to sort of think about that and articulate, how do you do that, and when do you do that, and why do you do that?
Yeah, Tim, I appreciate that perspective, because it really helps us narrow in on this question of the application of AI and what it means to our personal lives, and where decisions may be going out of our control, as you just said. And David, I want to pick up on Tim's theme and ask you the question, and then Tim, come back to you. David, you mentioned this intersection of intelligence and the hierarchy of intelligence between animals and humans and what sets us apart. And machine would suggest that it's displacing humans in some pretty critical ways. I think, Tim, I heard you say about sentencing and jail terms. You mentioned health. I think we about ethical idea that our intelligence may be intersecting with human activity, let me take that back, overriding general human activity. The question should we let the machines make these judgments? Do they know how to be empathetic like humans? What?
Sarah, you're breaking up a little bit.
I'm sorry, David. I went out at the end. I asked, how would you respond to where the machines are overriding the human decisioning process, just as Tim mentioned, with examples like health, with delivering a judgment, perhaps jail time. How do we think about the machines in this construct?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I think one of the questions you would ask around that is related to what functions are the machines performing on behalf of the humans, right? And I think there's a whole like spectrum of functions that you could use machines to perform those functions for. And then there's ones that involve judgment, ones that involve morality, ones that involve a question of values of the human. And I think that's where it starts to get a little gray. And so I do think there's a spectrum to look at there. And then when you talked about judgments, there's the COMPAS program that's out there that's used by the judicial system. And Tim, you might be able to speak to this one, much better than me, not being a legal background on my side. But I think that's a really interesting project to look at and talk about, because you're talking about a judgment on behalf of a judge, and that's going against the defendant. And there's been some really interesting studies into the algorithms that produce, false positives and false negatives, and and how that's disproportionately, placing bias on certain groups like the Black community. And I think that's very problematic, I think, when you look at that data and that study. But you look at just what that function is that the AI is performing, it's really providing a prediction on the, the likelihood of that defendant to, have a crime that they reoccur. So are they at risk for reoccurrence? And I think that's, as an input to a judge, potentially a fair thing. It's not making a decision or issuing a sentence on behalf of the judge. It's an input into that judge. Now, the question to me there is like, is the judge biased, right? How does that input influence the judge's decision? And I think there's been also really cool studies that are out there related to the judicial system and judges, and giving them, certain stimulus in terms of information and seeing how that impacts, and it does indeed impact certain judgments against defendants and their degree of the sentencing. And that's not even in an AI setting. So I think that these systems an AI system has its deficiencies. I think it has its biases, but so do humans, right? We're deeply flawed, deeply, inherent biases. And I think what's interesting is really looking, I think, in the beginning about what functions can we outsource to an AI, and what things are indeed, are we comfortable with? Now, my only caveat with that, and I'll end with this, is that, I think, Laura, you mentioned using the sports analogy and the early innings, right? And I think that was really an interesting analogy. And I think if we start off with, in the early innings, some of these routine tasks that we're automating that are safe, they're not necessarily involving human morality and ethics at a deep level, I think that would naturally make sense. But I think what's unfortunate about this technology is that it's exponential. In the fact that this technology, AI, by definition, can get smarter and improve itself on its own without humans, and start to take a path in which we as humans may not actually understand what's going on in that black box. And that's actually working today. We don't know in many cases how some of these neural network systems work. And we don't have transparency into that. We don't have explainability into how this output is being generated. And I think if we cede control to those systems now for rote tasks, they can very quickly start to perform these other tasks without us knowing about it and infect things because of just the way AI would naturally work, because we don't know. So I think the early innings thing's great. I do like that idea, but I think we have to be very careful, because I think this technology just has a darker side to it, like all technologies, but the darker side on this one can lead to potentially very existential related issues.
David, I appreciate that. And I want to pass the football. We'll keep with this sports analogy. No, Tim, we're going to come to you. But Laura, this is really where you're nationally known. This idea of bias in the models and how to unpack it and add transparency. How would you respond to that picture that David just painted about where we are?
Yeah, I would say agree 1000% that we have to be extraordinarily thoughtful about how we're deploying this technology and exactly where we're deploying this technology. For the reasons that David highlighted. It's powerful technology, can be extraordinarily helpful, Sarah, as you noted in your introduction, but the judgment aspect, as David noted, is a massive missing component of this technology. And it is something that I think for a very long period of time, if not forever, humans may be better at, I'll just say. So setting up the framework around how this technology is used and where this technology is used is, I think, extraordinarily important. And again, to David, to your point, these systems, these AI systems, regardless of, again, how quickly they can learn, how intelligent they learn, they are fundamentally built on the data from the past, and the data from the past is colored and shaped by biases of humans, again, as you point out. So I think a lot of I find it very interesting that, in many places we've thought, we can, and the judicial system is one of them, we can introduce algorithms, or we can introduce, AI into the system, and that's going to somehow, remove bias naturally from the system. It's going to all of a sudden just solve this problems of humans being biased. Well, the big Achilles heel of that whole situation is that, the data that is training these technologies, the data that is training the AI is the result of, if you will, the sins of our past and the biases of our past. So that is where I think transparency is just so paramount. It just has a tremendous level of importance in being able to continue to advance the way this technology is being used and expand the use cases it's being used in. Without that transparency, I think we can very quickly get into very significant problems that, again, where we double and triple down on things like biases, and actually, instead of lifting folks up that we're trying to lift up with the use of this technology that should be fair and should not have inherent and unconscious bias built into it, it does, because the data has it built into it, and that can just actually snowball on itself in really disastrous ways if we don't have the proper rails set up and the proper framework. And I think, again, transparency is, if I'm going to say one thing that's important to that framework, it is transparency into how the machines are working. I think that is the key.
Hey, Sarah, can I just chime in here? I mean, I want to just ask Laura, because clearly she's pretty deep into the bias topic.
Yeah.
I guess, I mean, the threat is there, right, for the AI to take this path that you've talked about, that's like self-reinforcing, perpetuating these biases. But I mean, I guess I look at like Facebook, right, and I look at Twitter, and I look at the fact that we're a couple days away from an election, and I wonder, like, is that genie already out of the bottle? Like, do we see the social media algorithms creating this divisive culture that we're in? I mean, I'd be curious to just ask it from like what we just talked about with the definition of AI and how AI could potentially, like, is that genie out of the bottle already? And do we already have data to prove that this is happening, and maybe the root cause of a divisive culture that we have in society today?
I think it's been let out in certain places. And I think the one you mentioned, David, is one where it is unfortunately out. And I think that it's been raised, or it's starting to be raised with wonderful discussions like the one that we're having right now. the importance of the ethical side of the use of this technology. Whereas maybe you could say in the last decade, people were so jazzed up about we have more data, there's more complex things we can do with that data that we can do faster because of greater computational power, and people were like full steam ahead. I feel that now there is a push that is happening. I'd like to see that push get out of PowerPoint presentations and into more action, if I'm going to say one thing, because I think that's where a lot of it is right now. But I think that can be corrected, right? I don't think we've gone too far, I guess I'll say, David, but I think a lot of what we're seeing play out in our country right now is the direct result of that self-reinforcing that kind of doesn't bring people together, heads people, unfortunately, further apart. Yeah.
Laura, I think that the dialogue the two of you just had was so powerful, and Tim, it strikes me this is such a cornerstone of your life's work, right? You came into this discussion because you saw the application of emerging technologies into a very important sector in financial services, but you saw it to help protect consumers in your work that I think has led you to FinTech Commons. How do you respond to this interaction, this idea, we've let the genie out of the box, we have to, proceed with caution. We have a great question from the audience. I'm going to extend that into a real life example, but can you just talk to us a little bit about your thinking in the abstract? Has AI right now, is it at a person level, are we seeing some harm being done to society?
Well, I think that, we've never been, particularly in this country, been very good at talking about decision making. It tends to be people line up on both sides rather than saying, well, why did you make that decision? Let's talk about it. And that's persisted, and obviously we're kind of at a fork in the road with that. So, but I'll sometimes I put different hats on just based on my different experiences, particularly in the business world. So I'd add one more thing, that there is a cause for optimism to some extent. So, probably most people tuning in aren't old enough to remember something called the 3 C's in financial services. And the 3 C's was the model where almost all lending decisions were made. The 3 C's were your credit, what collateral you were putting up, and then the third C was character. And there was no criteria for character. That was whatever your local banker sort of thought about you and your family and your friends. And so and that wasn't something that was really, there was no full disclosure there in terms of how decisions got made. And obviously there was bias built into that, and systemic bias built into that. So, there is kind of an opportunity there today in some ways to say, hey, look, what if we just start turning over some of these decisions to an algorithm that is hopefully objective, hopefully fair, hopefully transparent, and hopefully somebody is accountable for that decision, right? So I think there's opportunity here to improve things if we can get this right and get more comfortable with sort of examining how decisions get made in the AI world.
Does anyone want to offer a response to Tim? I have an actual question from the audience on a real life example of decisioning, but Laura, David, I don't want to, Tim made such a powerful point. Anything else to add? Okay, all good. So let me ask the question, because it is judgment call. It is this idea of who then is, in the seat of determining and systematically programming what is character, and what do we do when we make a mistake in that system. So the question we got from the audience is, how can we consider the impact of machine learning algorithms that manage autonomous driving vehicles like Tesla and the court cases that are currently going on around crashes? Who is responsible here? Was this the case study, by the way? I'm sorry if this is a case study, but who do we think is responsible? Is it the user? Is it Tesla? Is it the driver? When we talk about the application of judgment and the unintended outcomes of these algorithms, who ultimately is responsible in your opinion? And maybe it's none of the above, but I'd be interested. David, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at the question of who's liable, who's responsible in the event. There's a crash in some city, and ultimately somebody needs to be held accountable because that's the judicial system that we have. And I think right now I think we don't know. I mean, I think that it could be the manufacturer, as you mentioned. It could be the programmer that wrote the code. It could be the driver. And I think there could be a whole list of the regulatory bodies that are supposed to be there to help enforce that. And I think where I would go is the question of liability and the question of responsibility is a very human one. It's one where if you look at us as a human in our relationship to pets, what is an AI? Is an AI a pet? Is an AI a machine? Is it like our toaster? Is it like another human? So when that AI screws up, and when an AI screws up, they fail miserably. Like there's actual really interesting studies about they're very precise, but when they fail, it's an epic failure, right? And I think in these events where there's a death, and so there needs to be an attributable aspect to who's responsible. We don't know, but I do think that there is a real deep question about human nature in this question, and it's one in which a human is responsible because they are deemed to be if they're deemed to be mentally fit, right, and they were responsible for an act, then they can be obviously pinpointed and attributed to that fault. But with an AI, who is that? Is it? And then if it's our dog and our dog bites the neighbor, the owner is responsible for that, right? The owner could be sued, and the owner could be held responsible. But again, we haven't defined what an AI is in relation to the human, and I think that's the fundamental human aspect. So I think, to me, being a business guy who's focused on building companies and solving problems in the business space, I wouldn't even lend this question to the technologist. I would probably bring in guys like Tim that have very much a legal background, but I think we need to hear from, to be honest, a humanities background and philosophers and people that can help us unpack what does it mean to be a human. And when one human impacts another, we have that already, a blueprint for how that works from a responsibility and liability standpoint. But an AI, what is it? And I think that's where I struggle to see a framework for that, other than I think that what we're missing at the moment is when I mentioned the regulatory body, I don't think we are moving fast enough, bringing a regulatory body to the table to help provide some governance over, one, what are these terms? What is AI? Defining that. Culture is different across many different jurisdictions around this globe, and definitions for things like privacy are very different all over the world. And if we just have to start with things like principles, and there are a handful of bodies like in Europe with the World Economic Forum and the European Parliament, and there's a handful of organizations that are trying to develop certain standards for AI. And I think we're just not seeing enough of that. And you take this back to the US, and where we had, like seatbelt laws, for example, like cars were crashing, people were dying, there was no enforcement of seatbelts because of lobbying by automakers, right, preventing that. And I think that's the same thing with AI to me. It's a similar vein. And I think we need to have a regulatory framework and body in place that is out there protecting the consumer from this type of risk. And I guess unfortunately, I don't have a direct answer on that one because I think it's a complex issue.
Yeah, that's why we're talking, because it's really complex. And Laura, why don't you weigh in here? The original question that got us here was the idea of an autonomous vehicle like Tesla, and killing someone, and who's responsible? The algorithm, the driver, Tesla? How do you wrap in what Dave just said? Yeah, and think about that.
I would completely agree that we need to have the regulatory framework in place to really, I'll say, assign accountability and hold folks to those standards. again, we could use this to the social media discussion we had before as well, right? I think it applies well outside of autonomous vehicles to other uses of this technology, that our regulatory framework is just way behind. And as a result, we have too many situations where there are gaps that can lead to really, I'll say, challenging situations. And I would agree with David that it's extraordinarily complex to figure out, kind of to point the blame at any one person. You know, I will say, and this is a personal opinion of mine, I think the term autopilot that Tesla uses is an extraordinarily misleading term. I think it's an extraordinarily misleading term for what, if you actually read the manual of the car, what they tell you to be doing in autopilot. And that's why you have examples where people are reading books when they're in autopilot mode instead of having their, you know, doing what Tesla tells them to do in the manual. But we don't read manuals, we don't read instruction books, and that's just humans. So I would say that it's a very misleading term. And again, you know, should there be regulation around the terminology that is used and how different levels of autonomous systems are communicated to the user such that the user uses them in the way that the technologist intended? I think yes. And, you know, Lord knows we have regulation around the way a lot of terms are used, you know, whether, you know, throughout other parts of our lives. So why not in this part as well? Because otherwise the education component of it becomes way too hard and way too challenging. So that's one thing I'll offer kind of specifically to it. But again, would love to hear your thoughts on this, Tim, as well. Of course, which I know Sarah's about to hand it to you. Yeah.
The whole thing about reading books, I read a book in my 2016 Jeep Wrangler, so I may not be the right person to.
While driving down the highway.
Yeah. So, but a couple of things. One is it doesn't get talked about much. Is a lot of these things, like who are you hauling up? Who's programming in decisions? I mean, if you're driving down the street and a woman walks out in front of you with the baby carriage, and the only alternative is to, you know, drive into a crowd on a sidewalk, how is that programmed into your Tesla? What does it do at that point? And I don't know. I'm curious how they go about that. Having been a regulator in a technology area, I can tell you with almost zero uncertainty that that almost no regulators have a real framework for being able to make reasonable judgments about this, and a real education process needs to take place, you know, in other areas, and get that to regulators, I think, before you're going to see effective regulation around AI. We're not good at that in this country. We're much better off in Europe in terms of discussing these issues, putting them on the forefront, and coming up with, you know, proposals and preliminary regulation that people can look at and study and talk about. We're just kind of backwards in that regard here.
And one thing, if I may, Sarah, just add to that problem. I mean, Tim, and again, I'm reasonably up to date on this, but it's not known what choice the car would make in that situation. And then again, not to harp on the transparency point again, but I think that's probably part of the issue. It's also not known what decision the car would make if it's a choice between a pedestrian's life and the driver's life, right? And there's a lot of very interesting discussions going on right now about where is that being made? Is it being made at the auto manufacturer level? Which you can imagine a kind of dystopian future where, you know, if you drive a certain type of car, it says something about who you are as a driver and how you value your life over that of others, and all of these kinds of other very existential questions that come into play, because there is a lot of complexity around how those decisions are being made, and a real lack of transparency around how those decisions are being made.
It's probably like Skippy Johnson in the corner of the software room of Tesla, right? That's, you know, nobody even knows that he did it, right? He's just flipping a coin when
So I'm going to ask.
One real quick point that I would add, I think it's fascinating. I mean, just to build on what Laura and Tim are talking about here, is that, you know, with this event that we're talking about, this like single one event where an autonomous vehicle has run into someone, we're all like on edge about it. And what I think that just the edginess of this, a fact that a machine has killed someone and we don't know who was behind it or controlling it or who's responsible. That is a very, I think, new experience for just human beings in general. And I think like that's why, you know, there's car wrecks going on right now where humans are behind it and we're okay with it. Well, that's a statistic at this stage, right? And I think that it's such a new, fascinating world, and that is an experience that we're uncomfortable with. And I think we have to look at that uncomfortable nature. Why are we uncomfortable with that? What is this machine to us? It's representative of, you know, us as a human in a new form. And how do we deal with this? And I think that's a problem that needs to be explored. And I agree. This is an opportunity for people to come together and start to look at the way technology is not just reshaping our economy, but it's how technology is shaping our entire society. And what do we want out of that society? How do we want our life to be? What do we want work to look like? You know, how do we want to deal with transportation in the future? Like, this is opportunity. And I think that's a really interesting thing. But I think we're all perked up because the machine has done something and we don't know. And is it going to do other things, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really interesting just point if you look at it and just pause and think about why are we on edge about that one point.
Yeah, it's an incredible question. So audience, keep asking great questions. There's another really good one that's germane. And I just want to put a dangling question out there. It does not deserve an answer, but when we have beers together again, it totally will be worth it to do it. Why wouldn't we let the AI system arbitrate the outcome and make a decision? Why couldn't the technology figure out where the tech went wrong? No one answered that. I know it's very bad, but that's a beer question for everybody. But the more important question from the audience, David, picks up on what you just said, and that is the responsibility of society, the responsibility of ourselves to think about the ethical implications. They asked the question, and Laura, it was taken off out of your content, or your construct about social media. Do you really think tech companies will heed the warnings that we're all seeing, that we're talking about right now? If you watch the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, social media companies were well aware of the existential threat, geez, why can't I say that word, that came through with the use of AI to drive time to spend on their app, yet they continue to use these algorithms. How is it that we can introduce ethical decisioning, ethical influences in the use of AI if arguably the developers or one part of society aren't with us? What do you all say to that? Tim, you've taken a position on really hard questions before.
Me?
What happens? Yes, please. Yeah. What happens when only half of society plays along?
So the question is, like, the large social media companies and the decisions that they're making. Yes. And what criteria do we use?
AI, if you will, was, they don't say this word, but relatively destructive. They were using AI to keep our attention, or in Laura's case, push misinformation, but they don't stop.
I think, this kind of goes back to the inability that we've had for a long time, which is to make, how do we talk about making decisions? What's, just having that discussion. We haven't ever had them before AI, before technology, right? Been a hard discussion for people to have. And it's a hard discussion now. And what we're sort of doing is letting, things fly and waiting until it hits the fan and then kind of reacting, right? And still with that, we're seeing it with Google today, right? The Google antitrust suit is probably, it's about antitrust, but it's also about a lot of other things too. If you read, the arguments that the government's making, it's sort of taking all the things that you're saying along with antitrust and throwing it in a big bag and coming after Google in probably the most scary way possible for Google. And I don't know that that is really going to put the issues on the table to be discussed. And the documentary I saw too, it is scary. And I don't even know where to begin in terms of how do we begin to address that? How do we begin to say no? But it's got to start soon.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Because let me turn to you, Laura, because you do actively address it. That is the thesis of Stratify. When there is bias or when mistakes made, if you will, you're trying to open up the technology for the user. Do you want yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it, like any, I guess, approach to a complex problem takes a multidisciplinary solution, and involvement from a lot of different stakeholders. So I think you're always going to have bad actors around, and I think that's a harder problem to fix systematically. But I think what you are seeing that is promising, and again, I'd like to see it continue, but it's a promising start, is that more and more people are looking at this topic of ethics and AI and how this technology is being used by companies when they're picking where they're going to go work. So you're seeing talent start to ask for these types of things and start to look for companies that take a proactive solution to it. So I think that's one step in the right direction that I hope will continue. Again, not to put it all in the government, but I do think government and regulation has an important role to play in addressing this problem. And then I think the more we can educate the end consumer, the better this situation could also be. I think that's probably the hardest piece to do, and to do broadly and to do widely, and to figure out a comprehensive solution to. But I think that's also a really important part of it. And I believe that we are part of this at Stratify, and this is definitely what we want to be. Technology can be used to help these problems. Right, and can be used to proactively address these problems. So it doesn't have to be an all or none situation. So it's, it doesn't have to be either I use AI and machine learning and I expose myself to all of these problems, or I don't use the benefits of that technology in any way, shape, or form. Right, you can have a solution in ours. I'm tremendously biased in this, but I of course think it's a particularly special one. Can help people actually do that, and as I mentioned before, kind of take the AI ethics and principles out of the spreadsheet and into their actual everyday practices, and to Tim mentions, into their decision making, even if that decision making is being automated. So I think technology can also play an important role in fixing this issue too. And I believe we are seeing it more and more move towards a lot of very interesting work in this area, and a lot of very smart minds going to help on that tech piece, which I think is a really great sign.
Yeah, Laura, I so appreciate that perspective. I want to do a quick round robin. We're at the end of time, unbelievably. Before I hand it over to Tim, he's going to announce the winner of the case study winners. But let's kind of bring it down. And David, I'll start with you. What Laura just said, the importance of education and equipping ourselves with the knowledge and the need, not only to apply these techniques in our jobs, but also recognize the influence on our lives. How do you think we do that efficiently? Do you have a perspective there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the most unfortunate thing of this is that the adoption of this technology will most likely lead to the displacement of jobs at some point. I think it already is to some degree, but it could potentially be significant. And in that displacement, I mean, the World Economic Forum put out a report recently that talked about, I think 50% of all work-related tasks will be automated by 2025. So that's only 5 years away. That's scary, but they also mentioned that a large percentage, I think 97 million of jobs would then come back in the form of, a new higher value add job. But unfortunately, what's misleading about that statistic, that we'll lose jobs, but we'll immediately gain them back. The workforce has to be trained in order to actually do those jobs. So, and unfortunately, that's where there's a latency that's involved. So and I see that as an educational system responsibility. And I think my perspective here is that, I think when Tim mentioned the 3 C's, we also have, I think it's like the 3 R's, right, in education. It's been around for, decades, if not a century, which are like reading, writing, and arithmetic. We're all taught that. And there's a great book by Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee at MIT called The Second Machine Age, and it talks all about this upcoming digital revolution. And they talk about this as one of their recommended ways forward. And I think that to revamp reading, writing, and arithmetic, because that is what we're all taught. But that's taught for doing calculations, to go work as an accountant, to count, not beans or it's like being a secretary and taking notes. And they're all very routine related tasks that can be done much better by a machine these days. So those jobs are at risk. But I think if we view this as, an input and output system, we're producing talented, we're producing, educated graduates. And the amount of time it takes to actually become value add in society is, 20 some years to get educated, to grow and all that. AI can be done like that and implement that change and how it corners around a turn, in an autonomous vehicle to an entire fleet overnight, right? And it's done in an instant with a software upgrade. And I think that's scary in the form of how we compete as humans to these new technologies. And I think, so there's a significant education gap. I think it's really addressed with providing the displaced workers and workers of today with an opportunity to retrain. And that's done through, providing various types of benefits, I think, in the form of, this whole concept of basic income has been out there, which is providing people the ability to retrain, on the government's dime, for example, to position themselves for those jobs. And I think that's a really interesting idea. And it gets back to the point of AI is getting itself into our jobs and our functions and our work. We need to decouple work and income, separate them, and take a look at that and say, work is done by people in a household. Work is done by many unpaid jobs. And that's what people love to do in some cases. But why do you have to have income tied to that? We as humans have been the producers of, output throughout history. And that's something to really take a look at. If we have these systems that can actually do these tasks for us, what is it in terms of work that we could be doing with our time, and what is income, and why are we having them coupled together? So I think there's an interesting point there to take a look at as well. But I would really look at that gap in period of time in which displacement occurs, and what can we do to retrain and relook at our education system, broadly speaking, even to the point where a 35-year-old can go back to school for 3 years and retrain and not have to give up their job, not have to take an opportunity cost away from, an earned income, and also pay for that school and take out loan and all that. Like, this model, I think, is really broken. And I think we need to look at new options for that. Otherwise, those jobs have to have people there to work in them, and we'll have a period of time in which we can't fill those, and that could potentially provide more opportunities for AI to continue to take those jobs away. So yeah, that's my view on that. But it's a complex topic, but I do think taking a look at education and finding ways to benefit students and benefit workers that have already graduated to go back to school would be a really important step forward.
Mm-hmm.
David, thank you for that. And that perspective, of course, on dislocation, right? In this period of time, in this gapping period we may see. Laura, let me ask you to kind of give a couple sentences on education and AI, what we can do. And then Tim, I'm going to hand it to you for your perspective, and then to announce the winner, because we actually did do some educational activities around this. So Laura, education for you, and
Yeah, I'll keep this one short, because I would say agree with a lot of what David just shared, and believe that the kind of transition of workers is something that we have not historically been very good at, and kind of helping people learn new skills and learn new vocations has not been something we've historically been good at, that we have to improve our ability to do, period, and have to enhance the financial ability for a larger group of folks to be able to do that. Otherwise, we're in a really, really bad space. And I think that focusing on tasks and skills, whether they're related to empathy, for example, and highly empathetic types of jobs, creativity, highly creative types of jobs, things that, in my opinion, I see as much lower risk of automation in the near future, retooling and refocusing our education to teach those skills, and in some ways refocusing our society to place a higher value on those skills, I would say, as well, is something that in short and long term we really need to do, to not end up in a situation where we have just a tremendous number of folks displaced and discouraged.
Yeah, and perhaps transitioning their talents that they have into maybe even training the data sets that are necessary for AI and other things, right? Well, I think I heard you
Totally.
both say that. There is a role for people here. It's incumbent to understand the implications of AI, pursue your education around it, think critically. And Tim, I know you've got some really thoughts here. You've just participated in the ethics competition as well and helped us really think about the importance of education in the application of AI. Can I turn to you for the last word?
Absolutely, absolutely. So Sarah called me or emailed me a few months ago and asked me if I'd be interested in getting involved with this project. It's two parts really, what we're doing tonight, the AI panel, but the big part has really been a statewide contest in West Virginia, open to any college or undergrad or graduate student in the state, and with the focus on AI. And really, I mean, just exactly what we've been talking about, I think, tonight, and in that it was an AGO program, something, go tell us what kind of, but hey, give us an application of AI. It doesn't matter what it is, something you're interested in, and talk about it. Talk about what it does, talk about the pros and cons and the ethics of it, and try to come up with a framework for how you would evaluate that, the pros and cons, if you're in business in the future, or in nonprofit, whatever you happen to be. And really just encouraging all these students to think about it and develop a framework on their own, which is just a really cool idea. And I haven't seen it anywhere else. I was really excited to get involved. It's been a blast, working with a lot of nice people, and had a lot of submissions from the students. I also learned about this guy named William Mayer. So in the Mayer Foundation, who's been kind enough to generously sponsor all of this. And for those of us that are at a point now where we're thinking about giving back after having been in the tech world for a while, we have a propensity to I want to be the Amazon of giving back, or I want to be the Google of giving back. And this guy, William Mayer, this is 100 years ago, and he came from very modest means in West Virginia, and sort of pulled himself up by the bootstraps and went to Harvard. He was a Rhodes Scholar, and came back to Harvard Law School, and then returned to West Virginia to practice law, and got into the natural gas business. I assume he's one of the first people there, and obviously did quite well. So what he did was create the Mayer Foundation, which is still doing great things today, which was basically to support students in college students in West Virginia, support the system there, the university system there, and support students who are going to West Virginia, students who are going to school outside of West Virginia. So for me, it's just been a really tremendous example of giving back and how you don't need to do all sorts of grandiose, wonderful things. But you can be extraordinarily effective by focusing in on something and establishing a need. And so, 100 years later, the Mayer Foundation is God knows that William Mayer never knew anything about thought about artificial intelligence, but the Mayer Foundation has adapted and created this contest in the state of West Virginia, just to basically get students to start thinking about what we've been talking about tonight. So it's been a blast. And I'm going to forget to say something, I'm sure. And Liz, if you're out there, get ready for slides. So the competition, here we go. The competition began, a month or so ago. We gave some criteria. We received a large stack of initial applications. It was two phases. It was relatively simple to apply with an idea on a one-pager, and then we selected 5 or 6 of those to go to a second phase. And today we had those folks present to us in person. We had a judging panel with a judging rubric, and it was just really impressive. Not only, in and of itself, how the students did, but also how the students sort of progressed over time in terms of developing their ideas and their presentations. So I'm here to announce the winner of the competition, and that is Samantha Smith on the right there, who did a tremendous job her major is journalism, and she just applied the issues around AI to journalism in really cool ways, you know, and what the impact is and how to think about it and the future of journalism with AI, pros and cons, the ethics, et cetera, exactly what the competition was intended to do. And she just sort of knocked it out of the park. The rest of the folks, Eric Dillon did a great job, and Nathaniel Perry did a great job as well in their presentations. So we're happy to announce the first, second, and third place, and the top place going to Samantha Smith. Did I forget anything, Sarah?
And no, you didn't. You did it with enthusiasm. You remembered all the foundation stuff. But one of the things you also pointed out that through that thread was the things we talked about here. It is critically important that our generation, the generation that follows us, get involved and think about the ethical implication when we adopt these technologies. And I have been so flattered and honored to sit with the three of you tonight and just hear how your brain works, learn what you've done, and how we should think about this complex topic. And just want to say thank you, and so appreciate you all for who you are and what you're doing. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
See
you.
you.
Thanks,
Thank
Sarah.
you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for joining.